Hi there, and welcome to part one of a deep dive into what Miss Letby actually said on the witness stand during her original trial. This particular project is not something I ever envisaged needing to do. From the very first day of my own awakening about the case, the weekend after the original verdicts, it was crystal clear to me that the horror of her prosecution, and that most improbable of all convictions, were less about anything she had said to the police or in court than what information had apparently not been said to police or in court. As stated in several comment replies over the past fortnight, this new project is a direct consequence of the 5-part deep dive into the judge's summing up, which I completed last week. In sentencing Miss Letby, James Goss described her as cruel, calculating, cynical, deeply malevolent, a borderline sadist, absent remorse, and lacking any mitigating factors. As is frequently the case with those defaming another in pursuit of their own agenda, this is a picture-perfect description of the judge's own psychology, as evidenced by his conduct of Miss Letby's trial from beginning to end. In the same way that the most effective lie is a tweaked version of the truth, when seeking to defame another, we seem to instinctively understand that the most credible and readily available means of doing so is simply to ascribe to them those negative qualities we know to be animating our own behavior at the instant time. There is even the bonus of the palliative to our own conscience of it being an exorcising form of self-therapy. If we associate the negative qualities with the other, then we, in a sense, purge them from our own psyche, because if they characterize the alien other in our own mind, then it follows, by self-serving logic, that those negative qualities must be alien to our personality. That other is the bad to our good, the black to our white. So, on this predatory child logic of emotional immaturity, it follows that anything associated with their badness is outside of our own behavioral capabilities. Hey presto then, the evil we are engaged in against the other is magicked out of existence. I believe this is what psychologists mean when they talk about projection. One feature of the hatchet job on Miss Letby, which was the summing up, was, unsurprisingly, the repurposing of elements of her testimony for James Goss's agenda. It wasn't just the selective use of words and phrases out of context to create an inference out of thin air, which anyone with the rudiments of a critical faculty will be familiar with from our own corporate-controlled media. It also extended to him putting words in her mouth which were counterintuitive in that they were not consistent with known defense strategy, or they represented a position inconsistent with what a rational person in Miss Letby's predicament might reasonably be expected to take. By the time I'd recorded the third of the 5 parts, I was becoming aware that these misinformations and disinformations were contaminating my already incomplete picture of both Ben Myers's strategy in presenting Miss Letby's defense and her as a person to the jurors, and what Miss Letby herself had actually said on the witness stand. More importantly, for my purposes, there was also a realization that the judge's selective use and general abuse of her testimony quite possibly went much further than was obvious to me at the time. Anyway, Miss Letby at the beginning of her testimony gave information that she originally qualified as a Band 5 nurse in September of 2011 after doing the 3-year nursing program at the University of Chester. The majority of the clinical placements while on that course were at the Countess, split between the children's ward and the neonatal unit. She then gives evidence that in September 2016, I quote report, she received a letter from the Royal College of Nursing about the true reason for her redeployment, that that she was being held responsible for the deaths of babies on the neonatal unit. She says she was putting in a grievance about being redeployed. She says she did not know at that time how many babies she was being held responsible for. She said she felt it was sickening to be held as a person responsible for the deaths of babies. I don't think you can be accused of anything worse than that. Worse even than that. I just changed as a person. My mental health deteriorated. I felt isolated from my friends on the unit. End report quote. I have to say that learning of this bit of testimony is for me a definite canary in the coal mine moment in relation to a stink from her conviction, if not a reek of outright evil, having a heavy hand in that jury reluctantly delivering that outcome. Many of you, certainly all who were members of the Science on Trial project, will have had the same sickening sense of what if that I had when, back in the early autumn of 2023, I first learned of the letter from the Royal College of Nursing and Miss Letby's grievance over removal from the neonatal unit. Like me, it would have been inconceivable to you that a British jury could have convicted a defendant of any of the crimes on Miss Letby's indictment had those jurors had knowledge that more than 6 months before police involvement and fully 22 months before first being arrested and having this so-called confession notes discovered at her home, that defendant had been explicitly told in a formal communication from the authoritative body for her profession that without any evidence or attempt to attribute criminal liability, she was being held responsible for those deaths and collapses, and her immediate response on being given that information was to initiate a grievance, not against the implied slur on her professional competence, but the fact of not being allowed to continue working at the scene of the now charged crimes. Now we learn that our jurors somehow found their way to a conviction despite being aware of this informational silver bullet for making the right call on a case built on circumstantial evidence. Granted, they would have been assisted in giving suitable significance to this information by knowledge that Miss Letby felt her position righteous enough to bring her parents all the way up from Hereford to help argue her case in the grievance. Granted, too, they would have been equally assisted by knowledge, also denied them, that the grievance was successful, resulting in a formal apology from the two men who happened to be the ones instrumental in a subsequent campaign, the successful outcome of which was her denunciation to the police. The jurors obviously had neither of those pieces of information, but they had something those of us who'd never worked at the Countess or were not otherwise intimately involved with the case didn't back in early autumn 2023. The information given by Miss Letby that even as early as autumn 2016, a time when police involvement wasn't even a spectre on the horizon of her worst nightmare, the situation had already impacted her mental health. She went on to give information that she was diagnosed with depression and anxiety, placed on antidepressants, and to that day, the day of giving evidence, remained on antidepressants and sleep medication, without which she was unable to sleep. Becoming tearful for the first time, Miss Letby gave information fully supported by all we have learned about her working patterns and social media activity, that her job was her life. In circumstances of imperfect information, the human mind seeks and fixates on patterns consistent with prior experience. Who has ever heard of a serial killer needing to go on antidepressants and sleep medication, especially at a point when their crimes appear to have successfully evaded detection as crimes? who on the other hand has not heard of someone suffering depression and anxiety as a real result of the stress of a toxic situation in the workplace. In any case, that diagnosis of depression and anxiety may have something to do with an instruction around that time to Miss Letby from personal persons unknown that she was not to contact anyone on the unit apart from three friends, one a doctor and two nurses. A further point has to be made here about 1. Ben Myers not asking the appropriate leading questions of his client, which would have elicited replies, making the jurors aware of her parents' role in her grievance and the formal apology which was the outcome. And 2. Miss Letby herself not somehow contriving to slip such information into her responses to those questions which he did in fact put to her. Myers' leading questions jump straight from September of 2016 to Miss Letby's arrest 22 months later, so it is pretty clear that he felt himself obliged to give an undertaking to the judge not to speak about the events of early 2017. I'm unclear how such a thing could be enforceable, but I think we can be in no doubt that such a constraint was in place. Based on his previously unsuccessfully pushing for full details of the grievance to be admitted as evidence, we can take it that this was not a matter he felt he had a choice in. As to how Miss Letby, fighting for her life and therefore with nothing to lose, could have been persuaded to not breach a prohibition which would have made absolutely no sense to her, and she must have recognized as harmful to her position, I have no idea. If I had to guess, I would go with the judge warning Ben Myers that if he went too deeply into the grievance, he, the judge, would instruct the jury to ignore not just the prohibited information, but the very fact of a grievance relating to the indictment. Miss Letby, on the other hand, could not have failed to see that knowledge that her parents had been involved would signal clearly to the jurors that they were looking at the somewhat infantilized young adult she was, rather than some serial killer. So I'm guessing she probably did go off reservation on the details of the grievance, and Goss simply used his dictatorial powers as judge to have the relevant utterance or utterances wiped from the documentary record of the trial. Don't forget, there were at least a couple of occasions when the judge put proceedings into reporting lockdown. Presumably, this would extend to all documentary record of proceedings, not just the admittedly already selective and biased ones produced by corporate media. Anyway, as stated, Ben Myers takes Miss Letby directly from her perceptions in that autumn of 2016 to her arrest. Miss Letby became tearful for a second time in describing that 6 a.m. arrest of July of 2018. A police visit for which she'd been given no notice, contrary to some rumour. I quote report. Mr. Myers asks Letby about her being arrested for the first time. Letby says this was nothing like she had ever experienced before. Wiping away tears, Letby says there was a knocking on the door at 6 a.m. from police at her Westbourne Road, Chester home. At the time, her father was with her. They had no idea at all the police were coming that day. They told me I was being arrested for multiple counts of murder. They put me in handcuffs and took me away in her pajamas. After 3 days of police interviews, Letby was released on bail. She says she was not allowed to return to her Chester home and went to live with her parents in Hereford. Becoming tearful, she says the second arrest in 2019 was a mirror image of the first arrest. It was just the most scariest thing I have ever been through. It just traumatizes me. End report quote. The shocking picture given by Rachel Aviv in that New Yorker article of May 2024, fully a year ago now, a picture totally unknown to any reader or viewer of UK corporate media, of the hunted figure of Miss Letby jumping at any movement or sound in her vicinity, is confirmed by her in her testimony. She gives information of a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder by the prison psychologist associated with her being startled by novel sounds and things in her vicinity, around her. Myers then moves on to the so-called confessional notes. I quote report. Letby says about her notes, "It's something I have done my whole life." She adds she has difficulties throwing things away, and that includes notes. End report quote. I personally think Miss Letby was almost certainly referring to the practice of actually committing her thoughts to a diary rather than ad hoc post-it note adjuncts to that diary when she made the point about it being something she had done all her life. The most convenient diary size is A5. A4 not fitting readily into most handbags, and with all that was going on in her life, and therefore in her head, she probably struggled to fit all her thoughts for a given day on a page of A5, and therefore supplemented pages as necessary with post-it notes. As stated in my previous video, in common with millions of people in the UK, Miss Letby is clearly an undiagnosed sufferer of mild obsessive-compulsive disorder. Unlike with the grievance, Ben Myers even is allowed to do his job here and does so. He leads Miss Letby through the fullest explanation to jurors of the content of the notes. I quote report. It's a long one. Letby says she had written, "I haven't done anything wrong," because she hadn't done anything wrong. She said in the worst case scenario, the police would get involved. Re slander and discrimination. She says that was how she felt the trust was towards her in regard to the allegations. Re I am an awful person. Letby said at the time she did feel an awful person as she was worried she had made any mistakes. She said she was being taken away from the job she loved for things she had not done. She adds, at the time she could not see a future for herself in relation to "I'll never have children or marry." She says, "My whole situation felt hopeless at times. Hate and hate myself for what this has. At that time I did hate myself." She says she was made to feel incompetent in some way. She says her mental health at the time of writing this note was poor. She says it was difficult with the isolation I felt, and this lasted 2 years. I killed them on purpose because I am not good enough to care for them. I am a horrible, evil person. Asked what she means by that note, Letby responds, "I felt as though I hadn't been good enough and in some way I had failed in my duties, my competencies. That was insinuated to me. I am evil, I did this. I felt at the time if I had done something wrong, I must have been an awful person." Letby says she feared she may have been incompetent, and because of that, she had harmed those babies. She adds she could not understand why this happened to me. She says, looking back, she was really struggling at the time of writing the note. End long report quote. Now, note in particular the heartfelt bearing of the soul explanation from her in relation to the capitalized, large print, circled hate entry which dominates one particular post-it note, the green one. She speaks of 2 years of living with a new sense of isolation, and that was before she even saw the inside of a police cell. Like the earlier testimony on the letter from the Royal College of Nursing and the related grievance, this is canary in the coal mine stuff for me and hopefully all of you. We obviously did not learn until summer 2024 that writing the notes had been suggested by her therapist, the head of occupational health at the Countess apparently. But even just reading the full content, without any context, there is unmistakable mixed messaging present to dilute the impact of the allegedly confessional stuff. When that mixed messaging is put in the context of the deterioration in Miss Letby's mental health, information not yet in the public domain in autumn 2023 because corporate media chose not to report it, not only does the idea of these statements being any kind of confession become asinine, but the notes, just by themselves, acquire added significance in the assessment of the case in the opposite direction. I still cannot see any reasonable person finding it safe to convict the author of those notes of anything on Miss Letby's indictment in any set of circumstances. However, not only do the jurors have the background of Miss Letby's mental health deterioration to give credibility to the idea that the notes support her innocence, they actually get the benefit of being talked through the various entries, being given heartfelt human explanations, and still they convict. If the ultimate object of the exercise of Miss Letby's trial was to prove that trial by jury was too unreliable and untrustworthy and therefore should be replaced by something, anything, it couldn't have been any more successful. For me, nothing discredits this jury, and by extension, unfortunately, the very idea of trial by jury, more than this particular failure by the jurors to follow through on the intuitions which must have arisen in their minds as they listened to Ben Myers take Miss Letby through the content of these notes. I am totally shooting from the hip here, but at the moment of writing, my own intuition is that someone with a long-term agenda of reforming or replacing the system of trial by jury with something cheaper, more streamlined, or simply more routinely predictable for authoritarian purposes, or all three, identified this abomination of a prosecution coming down from Cheshire Police as an opportunity to shred the credibility of the trial by jury system, thereby in the medium term, after Miss Letby's eventual release years down the line, achieving their judicial reform in the most painless and least effortful way, that of getting the public clamouring for the change, as opposed to having people fight it tooth and nail, which almost certainly will otherwise be the case. My thinking just now is that if they were able to achieve, even at great effort, an outcome, the outcome that we see in Miss Letby's case, the system is not fit for purpose, if not already so broken that a change will be no loss. That might sound defeatist, but whether or not the thesis just delineated is correct, this case was, for the system of trial by jury, the equivalent of an integrity test for an individual. That integrity test was failed. Yes, I accept that important evidence was kept from jurors through the consultants withholding it from police and CPS breaching disclosure requirements on the evidence they did have, and a corrupt judge simply ruling inconvenient evidence inadmissible. But tests are by definition hard. If it wasn't hard, it wouldn't be a test. By any measure, Miss Letby's jurors failed this integrity test. What's more, it was not a failure of competence, but a failure of will. 13 days of deadlock show that members of that jury recognized that they were being railroaded to a verdict. Even if this is only true of one juror, something I very much doubt, it remains a collective failure. As they say, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. Anyway, after spending 15 to 20 minutes educating jurors as to the fact that these notes added nothing to the prosecution case and actually weakened it, Ben Myers returned to the background career information before going on to the counts on the indictment. Miss Letby's first placement in the neonatal unit at the Countess during her that 3-year course nursing program had been in September of 2010. She commenced full-time employment as a qualified nurse in January of 2012. I think this bread and butter information is important because it wasn't until December of 2024 that I realized that the first 3 deaths of June 2015 didn't actually happen during Miss Letby's first week of employment on the unit, and I thought I was well informed on the case. I have no doubt that there will be people under the same misapprehension encountering this video in future. Anyway, at the time she started work there at the Countess, she was not qualified to care for the babies in need of intensive care, the Room 1 babies. Only those in the less dependent babies, the less ill babies, in Rooms 3 and 4. That intensive care qualification, a 6-month course at Liverpool Women's Hospital, was completed by her in April of 2015. Right, this video is now threatens to be overlong, so I will end part 1 here and pick up part 2 with Miss Letby explaining the role for her of bits of paper in those computerized incident reports generally completed retrospectively at the end of the shift. Feel free to share your thoughts and any information you think might be of interest to anyone in the comments section below. As usual, thank you for watching, thank you for your time, and all the best.